The marketplace bustled with its usual chaos. Merchants hawking their wares, children darting between stalls, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the acrid scent of livestock. But Sarah stood apart from it all, her eyes downcast, her wrists bound loosely with rope more symbolic than secure. She was 17 years old, and this was the third time her parents had brought her here, hoping someone would take her off their hands. Her mother wouldn't meet her eyes. Her father counted coins in his palm, already calculating what he might buy with the money they'd receive. Sarah had stopped crying about it 2 years ago, when the doctor had confirmed what the village midwife had suspected. She would never bear children. In their small farming community, a daughter's worth was measured in the alliances she could forge through marriage, the grandchildren she could provide, the extra hands she could bring to work the fields. Sarah offered none of these things. The first time they'd tried to marry her off, the young man's family had demanded their dowry back within a month. The second time, the arrangement fell apart before the wedding could even take place. Now, her parents had given up on marriage entirely. They simply wanted her gone, and they'd take whatever they could get. Strong back, good with cooking and cleaning, her father announced to anyone who slowed their pace. Quiet, obedient, won't cause any trouble. Sarah felt like livestock. She supposed that's exactly what she was now. The day wore on. A few people stopped to look, but when her father reluctantly admitted her condition, unable to lie outright for fear of having her returned yet again, they moved on quickly. By late afternoon, her father's voice had grown hoarse, her mother's face pinched with frustration. That's when she saw him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could snap timber in half. His clothes were worn but clean, his dark beard streaked with early gray, though he couldn't have been much past 30. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Sad, tired eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the entire forest he must work in. He stopped in front of them, not looking at Sarah but at her father. "What's wrong with her?" he asked bluntly. Her father launched into his practiced speech, but the man held up a hand. "I asked what's wrong with her, not what she can do." Her father's jaw worked. "She's barren. Can't have children. But she's healthy otherwise, and—" "I don't need more children," the man interrupted. "I have 4 already. Their mother died last winter." He said it plainly, without self-pity, but Sarah heard the grief underneath. "House is falling apart. Kids are half wild. I work from dawn to dusk and still can't keep up." He finally looked at Sarah then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Kindness, maybe, or at least the absence of judgment. "Can you cook?" he asked her directly. She nodded. "Manage a household? Handle children?" "Yes, sir. My youngest is 3. Oldest is 10. They're struggling. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm looking for help. For someone to care about them while I work. Can you do that?" Something in Sarah's chest loosened. Not a wife. Not expected to be something she couldn't be. Just help. Just someone to care for children. "Yes," she said, and meant it. The man, Thomas, she'd learned his name was Thomas, negotiated a price with her father that made the older man's eyes light up with greed. The amount was more than fair, more than she was worth by any measure. She realized Thomas was doing it deliberately, ensuring her parents couldn't claim later that they'd been cheated, couldn't use any excuse to come looking for her. "She'll need her things," Thomas said. "She's got nothing but what she's wearing," her mother said quickly, eager to complete the transaction before he changed his mind. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He counted out the coins, took the rope from Sarah's wrists and threw it aside, and turned to leave. "Come on, then." Sarah followed him through the marketplace, her heart pounding. She didn't look back at her parents. There was nothing there worth seeing. They walked for over an hour into the forest, following a rough path that wound between ancient trees. Thomas didn't speak, and Sarah didn't dare. She studied his broad back, the way he moved with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately. Finally, they emerged into a clearing where a cabin stood, larger than she'd expected but in obvious disrepair. Shutters hung crooked, the porch sagged, and weeds grew wild around the foundation. Before they reached the door, it burst open and chaos erupted. 4 children tumbled out, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging from tiny to gangly. They swarmed Thomas, shouting over each other, pulling at his clothes, all talking at once. He stood there and took it, his stern expression softening just slightly as he placed a hand on each head in turn. "Enough," he said quietly, and they actually listened. "This is Sarah. She's going to be staying with us, helping take care of things. You'll treat her with respect. Understood?" 4 pairs of eyes turned to study her with the brutal honesty of children. The oldest, a girl with her father's dark hair and what must have been her mother's delicate features, crossed her arms. "We don't need help. I can take care of everyone." "Emma," Thomas said, and there was a world of gentle exhaustion in that single word. "You're 10. You shouldn't have to." The little one, barely more than a toddler with a mop of wild curls, reached up to Sarah without hesitation. "Up." Sarah bent and lifted her, and the child settled against her hip as naturally as breathing. The weight felt right. The little girl smelled like dirt and honey, and something in Sarah's chest that had been frozen for so long began to thaw. That first night was chaos. Thomas showed her to a small room off the kitchen, barely more than a closet, but it was hers. The children were wild, unaccustomed to routine or discipline. Dinner was a hurried affair of burnt stew and stale bread. The younger ones fought over everything. Emma watched Sarah with suspicious eyes, guarding her territory as woman of the house. But Sarah had been raised on a farm. She knew about hard work, about making do, about patient persistence. She'd just never had anyone appreciate it before. She started slowly. The first week, she simply observed, learning the rhythms of the household, the personalities of each child, the way Thomas disappeared into the forest at dawn and returned at dusk covered in sawdust and exhaustion. She cleaned what she could, cooked simple meals, and most importantly, she listened to the children. Emma, she learned, was drowning under responsibility, desperate to be the mother her siblings had lost and terrified of failing. The middle children, 7-year-old James and 6-year-old Lucy, were locked in their grief, acting out because they didn't know how else to process it. And little Mary, the 3-year-old, barely remembered her mother at all, which seemed to be its own kind of tragedy. Sarah didn't try to replace their mother. She simply tried to be present, patient, consistent. She fixed the holes in their clothes and made sure they washed behind their ears. She taught them simple songs while they did chores and told them stories at bedtime. She praised Emma's help instead of trying to take over from her, making them partners rather than rivals. Slowly, grudgingly, the household began to settle into something like order. Thomas noticed. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man of many words, but he started staying for breakfast instead of gulping down food as he rushed out the door. He fixed the shutters one Sunday. He brought home a rabbit he'd snared and showed James how to prepare it. One evening, about 2 months after Sarah's arrival, Thomas came home to find the cabin transformed. Sarah had spent the day cleaning with a fury, washing windows, scrubbing floors, beating dust from every surface. Wildflowers stood in a jar on the table. The children's laughter rang from the yard where they played some game Sarah had invented. Thomas stood in the doorway and just looked. Sarah glanced up from the stove where she was stirring something that actually smelled delicious, and their eyes met. Something passed between them, unspoken but understood. "Thank you," he said simply. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "They're good children. They are now. They weren't when you came. They just needed someone to see them." She stirred the pot, not looking at him. "I know what it's like, not being seen." That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas sat at the kitchen table while Sarah mended one of James's shirts by lamplight. The silence between them was comfortable now, companionable. "Tell me about her," Sarah said softly. "Their mother." Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Margaret. We grew up together. Married young. She was." He paused, searching for words. "She made everything lighter. Even the hard times. When she got sick, it was fast. 1 month she was fine, the next." He shook his head. "I haven't known how to make things light again. For them or for me." "Maybe you don't have to," Sarah said. "Maybe you just have to keep going until light finds its way back." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "Is that what you're doing?" waiting for light to find its way back. She thought about her parents, about being unwanted, about all the ways she'd been told she was insufficient. I think I'm learning that maybe I can be the light. For someone else, at least. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. I had a bad dream. Sarah set down her mending without hesitation. Come here, sweetheart. The girl went not to her father but to Sarah, crawling into her lap despite being almost too big for it. Sarah stroked her hair and hummed something soft and wordless until Emma's breathing evened out. Thomas watched them, and Sarah saw his eyes glisten in the lamplight. Seasons changed. Winter came, and the cabin that had seemed so broken became warm and full of life. Sarah taught the children their letters by the fire. She learned to preserve food and manage their meager resources. She grew to understand Thomas's silences, the way he showed love through action rather than words, mending Sarah's shoes without being asked, bringing home a length of fabric so she could make herself a new dress, building a shelf for the few precious books that belonged to the children's mother. And somewhere along the way, she realized she was happy. Not in spite of her inability to bear children, but because of it had led her here, to these children who needed her, to this quiet man who appreciated her, to this life she was building not from what she lacked but from what she could give. One spring morning, almost a year after she'd arrived, Sarah stood in the garden she'd planted, her hands in the soil, and felt Emma slip an arm around her waist. I'm glad Papa found you, the girl said simply. Sarah pulled her close, blinking back tears. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. From the edge of the forest, Thomas emerged with his axe over his shoulder, and across the distance their eyes met. He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. Sarah smiled back, her heart full of a joy she'd never imagined possible. She had been sold because she couldn't create life. But she had found her purpose in nurturing it, in these children who weren't born to her but had become hers nonetheless, in this family that had chosen her when her own had not. And that, she thought as little Mary came running to show her a flower, was more than enough.